Andy Austin here, up in somebody else's attic today. I'm away at the moment looking after a relative, and it's absolutely roasting. I think it's hotter up here than it is back home. Now, just down here on the floor with me, I have a little noisy fan. It's about 1,000 years old, so hopefully there won't be too much noise coming through on the microphone, but if there is, I do apologise. But there's not a lot I can do about it apart from start stripping off, and trust me, you don't want that. Alright, so I wanted to do a video to answer a fairly common question that comes up on the comment section of various videos that I do, but also via email. And this is, okay, so Andy, you seem to be rational, you're pro-science, you're not really a faith-based person, blah, 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 blah. People don't say that. This is me paraphrasing what I think they're saying. Do you believe in the occult? Do you believe in the Bible? Do you believe in demons? Do you believe in tarot? Do you believe in astrology? Essentially, the question is always, do you believe in X, Y, and Z? And this is the issue I wanted to get into, really, because for me, when anyone reduces something down to a question of belief, they have missed the point entirely. And so when it comes to, say, biblical content, what we have is a book that has become fairly archetypal because the way it was both originated, the way it was produced, and then reproduced over time, it's taken on an archetypal nature. And I think that's why so many of those stories resonate so powerfully throughout the Western world. Now, the moment you have an atheist who will say, well, you can't prove any of it's true, well, why would anyone want to? And then the moment you have a Christian who's saying, you must believe it to be true, it is the true word of the Lord, it is factual, it is historical, it's a document, again, they've also missed the point. And it's almost as if everything gets reduced down to a belief in order to disprove the other group, and to prove one's own point. And I think actually most of the time they're missing the point entirely. So I regard these things as sort of very good bunch of teaching stories, very archetypal and very, very useful stuff. The problem comes in when you have religion then becomes key all around articles of faith, historical record, and belief. So that's really where I stand on this, or what I feel about this. Now, when it comes to tarot, divination, all that kind of stuff, again, it's the same thing. I don't find belief to be particularly important or in any way valid. I mean, if somebody says to me, do you believe in the occult, for example, do you believe in the occult? We now have the problem about what it is they're referring to. So they're saying occult, referring to something they have in terms of their categorization of stuff in their head. Where I now think of in terms of what they're referring to may not be the same. And this is very true for most of these things. It's like, if you look at the NLP world, you've got so many different schools of NLP and NLP trainers. Somebody I've encountered in the last week, they're not teaching anything even remotely close to NLP. I don't see anything in there that's even slightly NLP-ish. And so that really is a bit of a problem, because now you have people who are learning from that person, reproducing it, setting up practice, probably go on to become trainers themselves, because everyone has to become a trainer of something themselves. And now what we have is an issue of they're calling this NLP, but it's in no way necessarily the same as, say, what Bandler and Grinder were doing, or are still doing. The same has crept in with most of these things. So, for example, there's lots of branches of Christianity. There's lots of stuff within alchemy. Alchemy was an operating science of its day, an operating philosophy, spiritual science, all that kind of stuff. It was really the overarching metaphor of the day. Quickly, the charlatans move in to make some money and want to teach it and make some money and exploit it and start quoting various alchemical texts and stuff, just like the NLPs do. Yet are they doing alchemy, or are they doing something they're calling alchemy in a way of making money? And it's the same with all of these things, is that there are so many people online who are teaching tarot or talking about tarot, and I despair, because I look at that and go, guys, that's not really, Now the problem is, I get bracketed with those people. There's also a lot of people out there who've got misunderstandings of the nature of the kind of stuff that I'm involved in, the stuff that I do, and will immediately assume I'm into spiritism, mediumship, clairvoyancy, psychics. That basically the pop cultural references to, quote, and I hate to do this, the occult that people have is in no way related to anything that I do. And So this is why largely, until sort of recent years really, I've not made a thing of it. I've not really pushed it or referred to it, because I got really fed up with the endless explanations I'd find myself giving people. But people don't want to hear it. They don't want, the moment you discover, or the moment they discover there's a lot of work involved, you can't answer it in a 1 minute conversation in 2 sentences. And it requires lots of thought, expertise and explanation. People aren't interested. They just want to know, do you believe in the devil? And that's it. That's usually the limit of it. Can you tell my future? Will I make money? Will I meet the person of my dreams? That's, again, the limit of most people's understanding. And I've got no interest in that stuff at all. So anyway, that's the background to what I wanted to say. Now, the thing that's come up, and this is what somebody was asking me about, was the whole thing about demonology. So I've been involved in lots of stuff around demonology and Goetia, various evocations, ceremonial magic, ritual magic, that kind of stuff. So why do I do that? If I don't believe in it, I've got to get people out of that paradigm. But if I don't believe in it, then what am I doing? What on earth is going on here? And why would someone like myself, who decries things like EFT and psychism and prediction and divination, why would someone like myself do these bizarre practices? Well, it's a tricky one to explain from an outset without going through lots of other stuff to begin with. But here is the easiest example I can give. A lot of this stuff is not what people think it is. These are metaphors and personifications and anthropomorphications and objectifications of concepts. For example, before Freud came along and named the id, the ego, and the superego, what did people use? What did people refer to? Now, Freud talks of these things as conceptual parts of the mind, conceptual parts of how people think, and that the consciousness we can have conscious function that we can say that's an id function, that's a superego function, and so forth. And then we could even go as far as to say, oh, well, okay, we've got the reptilian brain. Well, that's very much in the id. You've got the frontal lobes, that's very much the superego, and so forth. And so anatomical attribution is able to be made. Now scroll forward over 100 years, and now you have people saying like, well, my ego made me do that. I need to feed my ego. My ego is my biggest enemy. I need to kill my ego. I need to give up my ego. And now, essentially what people are doing is they're talking about the ego in the same way that medieval magicians would be talking about demonic beings, in that they have personified it. It's something to be fed. It's something to be battled, something to be fought against, something to be defeated. And it's exactly the same thing. It's just a different terminology. Now, if magicians and occultists came up with those words, they would have actually subdivided it out even further. So essentially within the nomenclature, is that the word? Whatever it is. Within the wording of magic and demonology, that kind of stuff, things are largely hierarchical. Now, as you come down the hierarchy, the easiest way to think of this is you have a single entity concept, and then it's subdivided out into parts that's hierarchical, and they all collapse into the original thing that you have. So if we had the ego, that's a high level metaphor, high level thing. The chances are that would be, if that's deemed to be archetypal, then if it's archetypal, it has what would be generally referred to as divinity. Now, just quick explanation here. Of the gods, there are 2 types of god. There are the gods that are creator gods, and they have always been. They didn't have a mum and dad. And then you have the gods that were begat or begotten. So they were the gods that were created. So you have, like Horus is a very good example of that. Brother and sister, man and wife gave birth. Osiris and Isis. Another classic virgin birth or non-sexual birth in the conception, and Horus appears. Horus is not a creator god. He doesn't have the divinity. Whereas Isis and... actually, I've got to be honest, I don't know whether they're divinity or whether they had a mum and dad as well. But essentially, a top-level metaphor that's deemed to be the highest possible archetypal will be the thing of divinity, and then it subdivides down from there. As you come down into the more baser, lower-level concepts, then they start to move from the divine into what would be regarded as demonic. Divine entities govern us, we govern demonic. So essentially man is positioned somewhere in between those things. So we have greater forces within our psyches that govern us, biological imperatives and so forth, and then we have those things within us that we master. Simple psychology, simple personal development. Now, if the magicians got a hold of ego and superego and id, they would have come up with something like this. In the classic way of naming things for divinity or for things to be of the divine, you can stick an on the end or an L on the end, EL, which largely means of God or God-like. So we would have ego L. There you go, there's an archangel. Ego L. Egon, there's a god. Actually, you can have an Egon that's somewhere between ego and ego L, and then you can name them further down from there. So now what we're going to start to do is divide out the concept of ego into smaller components, smaller parts, and then we can assign roles to those and even have physical descriptions or visible descriptions of what these things might look like. And so again, people have imagination as to how would you describe in visual terms an ego versus an id, which is a much more baseline, much more lower down primordial drive, versus a superego, which is much more divine in itself. So now we have a hierarchy. You have three gods: the superego, the ego, and the id. Although the id may well be the thing that is of the earth, therefore it's probably more demonic, and so on. It's something to be mastered by the other two. You can divide those out, give them lots of names, lots of L's and ons on the end, and so forth. And so now what we have is these personifications, these anthropomorphic beings, these things that have a visual description. They probably have colour and dates attributed to them, whatever it is that people feel is appropriate to be significant for that. And then stories may well start to emerge to explain the concept. Now, again, we just go to Freud. Freud gave loads of case studies and examples of the id, the ego, and the superego in order to explain the concept. Now, just imagine now we've got that into a magical format. Those would be the biblical stories of that magic. These would be the Bible of that thing. And now those stories are held to be the original stories that, tells us what these things are. It's the same principle. Now we can start to develop greater ways of understanding these concepts and principles by working with them. So in a ritual, for example, we can take on various parts. So I would play the part of Egon. We may well have another colleague in a lodge who plays Ego L, or we may invoke Ego L as Egon, whatever. And now we start to work with those parts in a psychodramatic environment in order to open up conversation and experience of them. And that's largely what we're doing with the magical stuff and the ritual stuff and all the rest of it. It's not the only thing we're doing. There's lots of other concepts that are being played with as well. But this is just the easiest explanation I can find for, okay, so do I believe in archangels no more than I believe in Egon, for example? Or Ego L? Do I believe in demons no more than I would believe in Freud's id? These are simple concepts that can be worked with. Freud developed a ritualistic basis for working with these things. It involved two people meeting in a room. One would have to lie down facing away, and they would take on the role of patient. And you'd have somebody else who's the operator, the magician. In this case, it would be the psychoanalyst. That's the term that is given to the priest, the priesthood class of this religion, who would sit at the head end of the couch, probably facing away from the patient, making careful notes and doing very little to influence the free association, the incantations, the utterances that would be noted down and heavily scrutinized and analyzed. In the same way that a lot of the spontaneous utterances that come from the scrying operations that are used in ritual magic will be written down, heavily scrutinized and analyzed in the same way. I don't see a great deal of difference. It's really just the language and the imagery that other people are stealing in order to give legitimacy to their charlatanism. And that's what I see. And because of the extent of the charlatanism, this is why we have the secrecy, the codes, the secret passwords and the handshakes and all this kind of nonsense. Largely because in tradition, people wanting to keep this kind of information away from the morons. that's why those who are sort of in the Austin inner circle, if I would dare to say that, why there's lots of information, especially on the metaphors work, that I simply don't teach publicly, because it's to use the biblical term, it's throwing the pearls before the swine. You've seen them on YouTube. The first time I taught the 0 equals 2 workshop, which by the way is coming up in a few weeks' time, again, the first time I ever taught that, the very same day of the first day of that training, an NLP trainer, who I shan't name, but won't, posted that he was running that course. And he actually had, based on the very little amount of information that had been gleaned from somebody else, that trainer wasn't there on the first day, had actually put up an advert and a criteria list, which was just copied from me. So this was, again, it just showed me just how quick people are to rip stuff off. Now that's what things like Freemasonry and things like the secret, all the different magical societies are up against. There's constantly a threat from the moron brigade who want to rip it all off. So there's a degree of secrecy that goes on. And that's why you have the outer order, the middle order, and the inner order. The outer order largely is open access. Pretty much anyone can join. And then that serves as a filtering process before people pass through the portal to the inner order and so forth. And so that's how it's structured up. So now what you have is a massive amount of information that simply isn't public. Unless you're part of those orders and largely into the inner orders, people simply don't know this stuff because there's so much stuff that isn't public. Lots of things leak out, of course they do, but they're largely not understood and replicated by people who are able to replicate it because they don't understand. They're always looking for the shortcut for the ego gratification. They're invoking ego L constantly. So I think that's all I'm going to say for this video. I can do lots more on this. If people are interested in this, do please stick any questions, any additional things, anything you want me to clarify, anything you think it would be interesting for me to talk about, interesting for you for me to talk about. Do please stick it in the comment section. Now again, I don't know if clicking like on these videos in the members section makes any difference to my YouTube channel, but do please click the like button. Every little bit that helps is always appreciated, and I look forward to your comments.